phone with Brad, and I pull into my driveway, and sometimes, as happens, I sit in my driveway in my car because I'm still on the phone with Brad. I'm like finishing the conversation with Brad, and Brad and I are talking, and all of a sudden, Brad, I look over, and holy hell, the gardener next door who's leaf blowing that whole yard, I don't think he sees me in my car, Brad. He's actively blowing all his leaves onto my driveway and just leaving them there. Yeah. And it felt like such a personal affront. I'm sitting 2 feet from him, but because I guess I'm in semi-tinted glass behind my van, he didn't see me, and he's just blowing away like. Brrr.
Oh my God. And you're sitting there watching him going, I think this guy's blowing all of his leaves into my yard. And he doesn't realize. And I'm like, can you imagine that homeowner coming in? Hey, thank goodness I've got a nice clean yard. My neighbor's a real jerk, though.
This Dave Kelly sure doesn't do a damn little thing keeping up his house. What? He's covered in leaves.
You know what you should do? Do you have a leaf blower?
I do own a leaf blower, yeah.
You should blow your leaves onto his yard and just see how long you can keep blowing the same leaves back and forth between your yards.
Well, I mean, you're not wrong in the sense that a leaf blower, it's kind of moving deck chairs around on the Titanic unless somebody gets out a rake at some point.
Yes, at some point, somebody's got to grab a bag and put those into a bag. It's doing nobody any good to blow these leaves around.
And on that note, everybody, I'm going to say hello and welcome to Comic Lab, the show about angrily getting upset about a leaf blower and all the injustices of those leaves coming onto your yard and making comics.
And raking and bagging and making a living from comics. I'm Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the cartoonist of Evil Inc.
I see what you did there with the interior rhyme of raking and making. Yes, I see you.
Yes.
You're not dead to me on that line. I appreciate an interior rhyme scheme. And I'm his friend Dave Kellett, cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and co-director of the comics documentary Stripped.
And this week's Hour of Comics Advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/comiclab. So Dave, let's make comics.
Let's make comics?
yeah. Let's just stop doing this podcast. Let's go back to making comics. Remember when we made comics?
All right, Brad. Well, I'm going to jump us right into our first topic for the show. And this comes in over at patreon.com/comiclab from Michael Lynn Jones. And Michael writes, hey, Brad and Dave, do you ever find yourself feeling the need to do more classical style artwork outside of comics? I do that from time to time to relax myself and just have fun. What are your thoughts? Brad, classical art. Do you ever find the need to do classical art outside of comics?
I've always wondered if we were going to get a chance to talk about this topic because it doesn't come up organically, to talk about my work in classical. And I'm so glad to finally have the opportunity to talk about that side of my life, because the truth of the matter is absolutely not. I have absolutely no interest, desire, or time. I'm a cartoonist. I do comics. In fact, for me, it's always been the opposite. In college, when I was in painting class, I would end up painting comics. And
Me too.
Yes. And if I was in sculpting class, I would sculpt comics related things that were related to my comic. I still think I've got somewhere in my menagerie here a ceramic mug that was based on one of my comic characters at the time, a pterodactyl. I like comics, Dave. I don't need anything else. I don't want to cast aspersions on our nice patron that it likes to do classical music or classical work or whatever you consider classical. I guess classical is just kind of like a word for old. It's classical because it's been around for a long time. If you want to do that, great. I more power to you. I never understood that. I don't get it. It doesn't work for me. But if you do it, more power to you.
Yeah, I think both. First of all, I really agree with you. Both Brad and I would agree that if you're doing watercolors or if you're doing oil painting or you're doing sculpture or you're doing carving, all of that informs your cartooning eye for shape, for color, for volume, for composition, right? None of it hurts. It's all lifting that boat, that rising tide that lifts that boat in terms of overall knowledge of how the world and images work. But I will say that I have been cartooning for decades and decades and decades, Brad. And when I'm done for the day or for the week and I take a break, I just want to take a break. I don't tend to want to do more art. Like, don't get me wrong. There's a part of me that wishes I could play guitar, or that I had a studio where all the oil paints were ready to go.
Yeah.
But the simple fact is, like, I've been doing comics for decades and I've gotten so much better, but I still feel in my heart, Brad, that I have so much further yet to go in comics, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I feel the same way. It's one of those things. The more you learn, the more you realize how much there is to learn.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
So it's like I keep shooting for a target that keeps moving. And to me, that's what makes it interesting. That's what puts the fun in the game. That's what constantly that challenge is there. And I'm trying to improve myself. So taking time away from that to do something else for me is just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like if I never had kids and maybe wasn't married, I probably would do more quote unquote other art, you know?
Yeah.
But my days are fullish enough where I'm like, when I have free time, I just want to work on cartooning.
Yeah.
And listen, not to besmirch Michael's question at all, because it's totally valid, but the idea of classical art, I want to talk on that for a minute, because Brad, you had said that just feels like art that's old. And I personally feel like you're kind of right, in the sense that, like, a Greek sculptor who was making a vase or whatever, or a Sephora, however you want to say it. And they did those paintings on the outside that were kind of sequential, right? They were kind of comics if you look at them.
Right, very much so.
I'm just talking about the ancient Greeks, right? But for them, that was contemporary art. That was, hey, I'm making this for my family or for the village or for, the city or the whatever institution they're making it for.
Right.
What I'm getting at, though, is Brad's onto something with the idea that classical art is just contemporary art plus time. It's not necessarily better. It's not necessarily it has value. It has value in the sense that we ascribe to something old, like, oh, well, that has value just by sort of not survivor syndrome. What's that phrase, Brad? Survivor's
guilt?
No, not survivor's guilt. The idea that it's self-selecting because it has survived all this long.
Survivorship bias.
Survivorship bias. Yeah, sorry. The very fact that amphora or that is still. Did I say Sephora earlier? I did. I meant to say amphora. The very fact that it survived means that is quote unquote better. Not necessarily. I mean, comics are just as valid an art form as painting, as guitar, as dance, as sculpture. And I think it's really telling that the French and the Franco-Belgian culture in general has adopted comics as the ninth art. And that's not something that Americans hear a lot, but they have their sort of 8 art forms that are, sort of held up as the premier ways for a human to express themselves. And then they've literally added comics culturally to the ninth art, and a lot of books in France and in Belgium are published sort of under a moniker of the ninth art. And the idea being that it is just as valid, just as meaningful, just as impactful an art form to communicate as painting, as television, as theater, as sculpting. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, Brad. What we do is incredibly impactful.
Yeah. And I listen, I think the French have it right. I think a lot of European approaches to comics get it right in that regard and have a lot to offer. And I'm not just saying that because I want them to fly us out to do speaking engagements. That's the furthest thing from my mind when I say that.
Oh, my God. We got to give some context to that, because my wife is going to Spain as a TV writer. Something either the cultural attaché of Spain or the embassy of Spain is having some artists out from the U.S. to Spain as a cultural sort of exchange. And Brad and I are like, how do we get on this train where the French or the Japanese are like, we've got to get some American cartoonists over here. How about Brad and Dave? They sound great.
They'll come out. They'll say some nice things. We're very nice, approachable people. We'll go out and make good speeches. We'll behave ourselves.
You put us in a tie, Brad. We look very presentable.
Yes. Yeah. Wait, look how good we looked at the NCS in those rented tuxes. We look fantastic.
We just need the Spanish embassy to rent us a tux, and we can be the talk of Madrid, Brad. The talk of Madrid.
I would be a wonderful attaché. I don't even know. I think I've even got a case for it.
Yeah, you've got to get the briefcase. That's the thing, is that you have
I've got an attaché case. I could do the whole thing. I'd love to be an attaché.
You just a tie and a case, and Brad is an attaché for the weekend. He absolutely for the weekend. That makes it sound sordid.
That makes it sound like sounds like a very different deal.
Hello, I'll be your attaché for this weekend. Oh, I love this cosplay.
I love how you just went Frank Nelson on that. That was a great callback. Yes, Mrs. Terwilliger.
Oh, Mrs. Terwilliger. But anyway, the Japanese, in a sense, also handled this well, in the sense that I really do feel like the 50s threw comics down 20 pegs in American and Canadian culture.
Yes.
Because of the House On-Americans activities, and also, what was the other commission, Brad, that had like child activities or whatever it was?
Juvenile delinquents that they were very, very upset about, and it was Estes Kefauver who had those hearings.
Kefauver?
The Kefauver hearings were very damaging to comics. It resulted in the Comics Code and wiped out an entire series, genres of comics, romance, westerns, horror comics, all wiped out by the Comics Code.
But now, you compare what happened in a sort of alternate history of America of what if had those congressional committees not happened, and that overall like culture scare that happened. With comics. Had that not happened, we would have what Japan has, which is when you get hired at a company and your HR packet comes in the form of a comic, or you buy a device and it comes in the form of a comic, as instruction manual, or you have a government issued document trying to explain the COVID vaccine, and it comes in the form of a comic, because they're an incredibly impactful, relatable, easy to digest, but also incredibly influential comic form that I see why the French hold it up as the ninth art, because it is incredibly powerful and it stands on its own. It doesn't need to be a less than compared to other art forms.
One of the greatest things I remember from when we visited Tokyo was how many people were openly reading comics, either in print in those big phone book size publications that you could get at any drugstore, or on their phones in a vertical scroll, panel by panel, just openly reading all kinds of different comics. And I keep thinking, if I went on the Broad Street line here in Philadelphia and opened up Batman and started reading it, I'd be beat up by the time I got to City Hall. It's even culturally, we look askance at people in terms of, we still think that comics are for children, comics are for kids, which a good chunk of them are. But if you're a grown man reading a Batman comic in public, you're going to get looks. Even today. Yeah. And we lost so much culturally as a result from that. And that's part of why we don't, this person is drawing the line between classical work and comics, right? And the thing is, comics are just as classical as painting. Comics are just as classical, and that's where the French have it right.
Yeah, it's something to really doff the cap to the French on, in that we don't. Although I have to say, Brad, in the course of our lifetime, from when we were teens to now, the gravitas and the appreciation that culture in the U.S. and Canada are giving to comics, in terms of institutional museums, in terms of universities with dedicated programs, in terms of increasing numbers of professors teaching it, in terms of Comic-Cons that are not just purely commercial, but also celebratory of the art, like TCAF or CXC in Columbus. I have to say, it's getting better in our lifetime in terms of an art appreciation.
Yeah, it without a doubt, it's gotten better.
Well, let me jump us into the next topic, Brad. This comes in from patreon.com/comiclab from KS Fabian Creations, who says, "Hey, Drab and Babe." That's a new one. I appreciate that. It says, "It seems the number one secret to success in comics is tenacity. But besides tenacity, what is the number two skill that anyone hoping to make a go of it with their so-so art needs to develop?" So thanks a million, Katie Fabian. All right, so Brad, from Katie to you, if tenacity is number one, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with, the sort of stick-to-itiveness that powers you through a decade of getting better and better and better. What is the number 2 skill set? And I would say nepotism, but I don't know what skill set would you say is number 2 that can power your career in comics?
Yeah, other than having a dad that's the publisher, which certainly worked out well, or I guess it was his Stan Lee, it was his mother's cousin was Martin Goodman.
Yeah.
But aside from nepotism, for me, I think it's developing an aesthetic. In other words, what happens when people start working on comics, they don't have an aesthetic. They don't know good from bad in writing and in art, right? They're just trying to put something on the page, and that's where we all start. That's where I started. That's where you started. That's where we all start. And the better we get at it, the hope is that you develop an aesthetic. You develop the ability to tell something that's written well from something that's not written well, or something that's drawn well and something that's not drawn well. And then you pick up these little things like never cross the word balloon tails, right? Don't do word balloons without tails, so I don't know who's talking, right? And stuff like that. Good lettering starts to come into it. Good composition, where you're placing those people. And the more you're developing those aesthetics, and again, I used 3 art examples there, but I can also go writing in terms of like, let's take writing humor for an example, hitting the punchline and that not saying anything else after that, right? One of my pet peeves, somebody hits the punchline and then they have somebody else deliver another line after that, right? There's writing aesthetics that you develop, how to set up a punchline well, how to deliver it well, how to set up a drama well, how to set up a mystery well, how to set those character arcs up. It's all, for me, comes down to aesthetics. It comes down to looking at your own work objectively and where it needs to be improved. Looking where strengths need to be extrapolated and where weaknesses need to be addressed. It also means looking at other people's work, looking at great work and saying, why is that great? Why is that speaking to me? What is this person doing that I need to learn from? And it means taking a look at work that's not so strong and identifying those and saying, am I doing that same thing? I can see it wrong when they do it. Can I see it wrong when I'm about to do it?
Right.
All of that for me falls under aesthetics. It falls into developing an eye for what's without putting it in, broad terms, what's good and what's bad. And what happens as you go down the road is, my hope is, and I don't know that this happens automatically. Like there's a few people that I've seen their work for like going on 20 years now, and I cannot tell you for a fact that they've developed an aesthetic. The stuff they're doing is not improving. You know what I mean?
Not only do I know what you mean, that was exactly how I was going to chime in when I was going to let you finish your thought. But yes, I mean, to me, tenacity without Brad's phrasing of aesthetic, or how I would term it would be like an editorial eye. Without that aesthetic / editorial eye, tenacity just gets you a huge volume of the same work that you started with. Of crappy work, yeah. And so I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, but I can think of 2 or 3 webcomics that started in the late 90s that are still online right now that look exactly the same as how they were drawn in the late 90s. They've got tenacity. Make no mistake. They are at the desk every day. They are drawing. They're doing the work, but they're not. And I don't know how to say it other than there doesn't seem to be an attempt to get better or to improve or to change. And so much of that, to Brad's point, is they never developed their aesthetic eye, or as I would say it, their editorial eye, to seeing where the faults lie, what's wrong, what is working and can be built on, what's not working and needs to be thrown out. And it just seems like they are. Is stasis the right word, Brad? They're stuck in stasis.
It's like they're not paying attention. They're putting out work. They're putting out work. They're putting out work, but they're not paying attention to that work. And so the work is never improving, because it's like they're doing certain things that you're like, If you were paying attention, you'd know that these jokes aren't landing. If you were paying attention, you'd know that you're putting way too many text into these comics, way too many words in the word balloons.
Right.
Scott always used to get upset at me. We would do panels together, and I used to say it's impossible to get worse at something you do every day. And he'd always bristle. He's like, it ain't impossible. I see people doing it. and I've actually had to change that because he's right. I actually changed it to it's hard to get worse because it's an optimistic. The whole point of that phrase is optimism. It's hard, right. But you also have to have a little bit of reality with your optimism. So I changed it to it's hard to get worse at something you do every day because I'm telling you, there's folks out there doing it. They're doing the same comic that they were doing 10, 15, even 20 years ago, and they're not improving. The writing is not getting better. The art is not getting better. You see them draw hands. They're still the same horrible hands they drew 10 years ago.
It's almost a form of self-flagellation in the sense that, yes, for 20 years, you've been putting out consistent daily work.
Right.
It's the same thing. Like, where is the sense of self-improvement? Where is the eye towards trying to get better? I mean, I'll put it this way. I don't know that all my experiments in comic work, right? Like, I'm very willing to admit, like, I've tried, UPA animation style just for fun. I tried heavy cross-hatching just for fun. I tried watercolor in my analog line art just for fun. A lot of those experiments didn't work. But overall, you do that year on year, day on day, week on week, and experiment and try and change and grow. Growing really is the active word there.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, you'll look back over 10 years and go, oh, I do see that I got better over these 10 years. Like there was improvement. And so for the cartoonists where we see that they've got tenacity, they are still drawing every day for the last 25 years, but they have not gotten better. It's almost confounding because it's like a willing horse blinder that's been put on towards not improving, not changing, not doing anything. I mean, is that too strong, bet? Is it willingly not changing, or is it?
I don't know that it's willful.
Passively?
I don't know that it's willful. I think what it comes down to is it's not that they're willfully putting on blinders. It's that they're willfully resisting the idea that they might need improvement.
I mean, if anything, Brad, in terms of like I could jokingly point out things that you're doing wrong and you would laugh, or if you jokingly pointed out things I'm doing wrong. But the truth is, if you pulled me aside as a friend and said, hey, listen, this is a thing that I just think you should look at in your artwork, I would listen to it because you and I have a desire, I think, to get better. Like I still, as quietly proud as I am of the work that I'm making, I see actually a lot of ways that I can get better in the next 5 to 10 years. And I want to approach that. I want to jump on that train. I don't try to avoid it. And I don't try to stay the same simply because that's what the audience expects. Do you know what I mean? Like this is the Dave Kellett art style that they know, or this is the Dave Kellett writing style that I know. Like in a way, I'm almost flummoxed by someone who refuses to change. That seems weirder to me than a willingness and a desire to grow and change and get better.
Well, and it's fear. Right? It's fear because what it says is if I'm not good at this and I thought I was good at this, then what else am I missing? Right? And at some point you have to accept that there's no matter where you are on your journey, there's some things that you're not as good at as you will be in another 5 years. Right? You're always improving in some things. And that means that some things you're not doing as well as you could be doing them. Right. But that's a fearful concept. It's like, well, what else am I doing wrong? Right. What if I didn't see that? What else am I not seeing? And that's the wrong way to look at it. The way to look at it is that there's always things you can be doing better. And there's always things that you can take that challenge from. And one of the reasons I'm still doing this 20 years after I started it is that I like that challenge. I like knowing that there's things that I'm constantly getting better at.
Right.
If you're afraid of that challenge, it makes me question whether you're going to be doing this in another 5 years because it's the challenge that keeps you in the game.
Well, we know from the tenacity of some cartoonists, they'll stay at it. They just won't. They'll do it in stasis. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
they
that's
won't.
True. That's true.
Because I think they're passed on now. We can see a comic like A Wizard of Id, right? Like it never changed. The art never got better over decades and decades and decades. The tenacity was there. It came out every day. But the Wizard of Id looked the exact same at the end of the run of the original artist as it did when it started, you know?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. Like, I guess to Brad's point, I am very aware, hyper aware that the stuff that I'm drawing today that I'm very proud of, in 5 years, I'm going to cringe at, or I'm going to go, oh, yikes, I see so many problems. But the only way for me to get to that future Dave 5 years from now is to draw whatever is cringy right now that I'm going to be like, oh, yikes, that was the wrong way to draw that 5 years from now. But that's the part of the process. And so I see what you're saying, that some people approach that fear of future cringiness by never changing and never attempting the new and never growing. Yeah. Is that what you're saying? That that's sort of the avoidance strategy of like, I fear the future judgment, so I'm just not going to change.
Right. Well, yeah. And it goes even beyond that. It literally what I sense is a fear, like they can't see it because they haven't developed that aesthetic. So they like you say, for example, the crossbar eye rule, right? We get every now and again, we'll get a pushback on the crossbar eye rule. They can't see it because they haven't developed that aesthetic. They think it looks perfectly fine to them.
Right.
And then we say, well, it actually isn't perfectly fine. It's making your lettering just that much more difficult to read. Mm-hmm. And it's something that's, if you change it, you're going to be taking an incremental step towards getting better. Since they haven't developed that aesthetic and they can't see it, deep down, it touches off a fear of what else don't I see? And if I pretend this doesn't exist, maybe I can pretend the other stuff doesn't exist too.
Oh, I see. Because then it becomes, if you acknowledge the known unknowns, then you also have to acknowledge the unknown unknowns. And then it's like, well, how am I floundering at life at all? I'm not doing, maybe I'm not doing anything right. Yeah, exactly.
And the answer is that's not the point. The point is it's not about the other things you don't see. There's going to be tons of stuff you don't see. The stuff that I'm very proud of working on today has tons of stuff that I don't see that 10 years from now I'm going to see because that's what it means to develop your aesthetic. You're going to get a more nuanced understanding of what you're doing. You got two things in that. You can either let it scare you out of developing and growing, or you can let that spur you on to continue to progress.
Yes. And on that exact same optimism, let me end it on this optimistic note, because I've been doing Sheldon now for 25 years and Drive for about 10 or 11. I don't know. And I want to say that if you're afraid that future you is going to look back with cringiness, and it will happen, but I will also say this as someone who looks back on the Dave Kellett work of 10 years ago or 15 years ago, is that I'm very often proud of the Dave that tried their best on a certain page. Like I look at certain pages or certain comics and I go, I remember how proud I was to draw that day. I remember how happy I was with how that came out. Could I draw it better now? Absolutely. Could I write that moment better now? Absolutely. But I'm proud of that, Dave, in that moment that they took a big swing. You know what I mean, Brad? Like that to me is sort of an optimism of trying to get better, is that you don't necessarily look back with cringiness. Sometimes you look back in the same way that you look back sometimes at your teen or 20 version of yourself and you see the moments that they tried their best and you're proud of that version of you, you know?
Yeah.
And so if you can cultivate that kind of outlook, it actually is helpful towards a mindset of improving your aesthetic and improving your editorial eye, is that the knowledge that, yes, of course you're going to get better, but be proud of the steps that you're taking along the way to do it.
It's one of the reasons that I typically advise against redrawing old work, right? That's a question that comes up from time to time on this show. I'm putting the book together. Should I redraw those old comics? Should I rewrite? There's some things I think I could have written better. Do I rewrite? Do I redraw? And unless it's a very specific situation where it would be terrible to have that, or it would be really, if there's a misspelling, for example, or there's something really egregious there. I say don't redraw that stuff. I say be kinder to that artist who you used to be. Value them for what they did and how they did it, and put that work out there, because yes, you're doing better work today, but that doesn't mean that old work was bad necessarily. It was just different. It was just work that brought you to where you are now. It still has value. And of course, your readers completely don't see it with the eyes that you're looking at it. So everything that we're talking about there, Dave, is part of the reason that I suggest people that they don't redraw old stuff, but because it takes that whole good and bad thing out of it. It's more, that's who I was then. This is who I am now.
So all the tenacity that gets you to the drawing desk every day, all the tenacity that gets you to pick up that pen and start drawing, put that same tenacity towards developing your aesthetic every time you draw, or developing your editorial eye. Yeah. The two, when they are married together and go hand in hand, that's the way to get a better career. Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we've recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on Comic Lab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics. All right, Brad, well, we got a couple quick updates for everybody this week on the show. And the first one that I want to talk about is San Diego Comic-Con just sent out their booth billing for 2024. It's about 6-7 months away from now, maybe more than that. And I want to talk about it because Brad and I often talk about how tricky it is to turn a profit at a show. And I just want to say that my corner booth, first of all, the prices on San Diego Comic-Con, every year they inch up. And my corner booth at San Diego Comic-Con, Brad, you ready for this? With the early payment discount, $3,900 to buy a corner booth at San Diego Comic-Con. So for everyone,
$4,000 as the crow flies.
$4,000 as the crow flies. And so for everyone who remembers the show that we did a couple months ago, where we talked about like, hey, I had my best ever Comic-Con. It was $16,000. That was great. Well, you got to imagine 4 immediately flying out the door because that's what's happened, right? Yeah. And I mention this because, again, Comic-Cons have increasingly become a proposition that you've got to be damn sure you can make a profit, because the costs, keep in mind, I don't fly to San Diego Comic-Con. I don't pay to stay at Comic-Con because I've got family down there. I can, it's a tank of gas and a willingness to load up a Honda Odyssey van, and I'm at Comic-Con. Yeah. It is not necessarily worth it for you to do the bulk of 99% of Comic-Cons in North America or wherever you are, because the profit is so damn hard to make. By the way, Brad, we're not taking into consideration of those, aside from the $4,000 booth fee, the cost of goods sold for what I'm selling at those booths. Right now, a lot of those are underwritten by previous Kickstarters and the like. It's still, if I'm doing the accounting correctly, I still would have to account for cost of goods sold for anything that I'm selling at that booth. All of which is to say, boy, you better be damn sure to make a profit at a show, because these can be really quickly money-losing propositions for the average cartoonist.
Well, and that also is, I've had an ongoing fear ever since this past July, because when all of the actors and the writers pulled out of the Comic-Con and the studios pulled out of Hall H, the result was that a lot of people like yourself and some of our Patreon backers who were, sounding off in the Discord had really, really good years. They had, you said you had one of your best years ever. You hit a whole new high water mark in terms of your sales. And following people on Twitter and other places, I saw other people saying, yes, it was a great year. It was fantastic. It was wonderful. And my fear is that they think that that's going to happen next year. when the studios come back to Hall H. And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's realistic to expect that that's going to happen. But, gamblers' mentality kicks in so often with these conventions where it's like, well, I had a good year last year. I'm on a hot streak. I'm sure Hall H had something to do with it, but it's also maybe it's just that this is finally happening for me. And they feel they've got to go back to San Diego again. Right. And my real big fear is that gambler's mentality is going to kick in, and a lot of people are going to make that purchase without really being honest with themselves.
Right. And a lot of people, justify their attendance or their exhibition at a Comic-Con, myself included a little bit.
Yeah.
That when we do a Comic-Con, we're also doing it because, hey, there's networking, and hey, we're also gaining new readers, and hey, we're also, socializing with peers and professionals. And hey, maybe we're attending a panel or two or giving a talk or two like Brad and I did at San Diego. Yeah. And all of that has benefit. And it's true. But the truth is, I just want to give the update that you really, really, really got to do the math on whatever show you're doing, because there's often better ways to network, better ways to talk to your peers and professionals than having to buy this really expensive booth at a show.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it hit me not too long ago. We were talking about the NCS in a previous episode. And one of the pushbacks that we routinely get when we give our standard advice on comic convention, which is pretty much don't do it. Our standing advice is don't do a comic convention unless you've got a really clear pathway to making a significant profit. And again, that's with doing honest math and so forth, really counting up all of your costs and figuring out whether you made money. And the pushback we always get from this is, but I need to go to comic conventions so I can do that professional networking. I need to do professional networking. And one of the things we were talking about, well, what does the NCS have to do to become significant to the younger creators that it really needs to attract in order to stay viable and stay, something that has worth. Mm-hmm. And the NCS actually comes through with flying colors when it comes to creating professional networking possibilities. They've got, not only do they have regional meetups where you can meet up with other NCS creators in your area, they've got the Zoom meetups that they've been doing where you can talk to people internationally who are NCS members and create those moments of networking and those connections that you can make. There's also Jamar that has that series that he's doing on YouTube. That is the studio visits that you can also interact there. And there's the Discord server that Scott is administering right now that he's trying to kind of get started back up. There's the NCS Discord server for kind of day-to-day networking. It made me realize that the NCS really is doing an awful lot to do this thing that we keep hearing from people is so important to them, which is professional networking.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I agree with you that the NCS actually is great for networking. We had conversations both business and art-wise at the Rubin Weekend with the NCS that will benefit us all through this year.
Oh, yeah.
And into future years, right? So that's definitely true. But also, I just want to acknowledge this moment, a complete 180 turnaround of Brad Geiger from 3 years ago. Like, I don't need the NCS to the Brad Geiger of 5 years from now, who will absolutely be president of the NCS now that he has gone whole hog on the, and I love it. I'm here for it. I love how joy-filled, because in my best moments with the NCS, I did love it. I love it. And so the fact that you're getting into it and Scott's getting into it and other cartoonists of our generation, and I hope younger generations, I would love it if the NCS could become the thing in my heart that I want it to be. And I think it kind of maybe is on that path. So I'm so excited that you're going whole hog for it.
Yeah, I got to admit, I even it was like you watch The Grinch and his heart grows 3 sizes. I think it's been one of those kind of things. I think it definitely has been good for my heart. But talking about things that are good for your heart, you had another update for this section about something happening up north.
Yes. So as of when this show airs, you should have about a week left, maybe 10 days left. I think it's about a week to get your application in for the Alaska Comic Camp, which longtime listeners will know I absolutely loved. I've gone twice now. It's in Juneau, Alaska. It's put on by Alaska Robotics, which is a comic book shop in Juneau. Beautiful shop and run by wonderful people. And they really do a wonderful job of bringing in great people, fun people, creative people, supportive people. First of all, to have fun and just the community, the fellowship of fellow artists in a unique environment, which is Alaska. Secondly, to sort of have classes teaching one another, all for free, where we, in a somewhat informal, somewhat formal manner of that a camp setting can allow. It's been one of the greatest joys of my adult life. It's the kind of a version of the joy that we felt on the NCS weekend of just getting cartoonists together to go deep into the weeds, to talk about comics, talk about what it is to be a cartoonist. And what's funny, Brad, is since we got back from the NCS weekend, I've been emailing all sorts of people saying, "Oh, you gotta go to Alaska Comic Camp, get your application in." I think you mentioned Jamar. I was like, "God, Jamar, you gotta go to Alaska. It's so fun." So you have a week left. Just an update, Google Alaska Comics Camp. There's nothing else like it, so you're going to find it on the first Google hit. And get the application in. You got about a week left from when this show airs, and I hope you do.
All right, Dave. So let's go back to our $5 Patreon backers. This question comes in from MJM, who says, I work on 2 series simultaneously, going back and forth between the 2, issue by issue. The Kickstarter for the most recent issue of my older series, we'll call it Series B, is wrapping up, and by all accounts has done well despite being my more niche series. But I realize it doesn't bring in the backers like my other series, Series A. Not to mention, I also enjoy working on Series A more. The conundrum is this. Series B is rapidly heading towards its conclusion. Just 2 more issues and the full story will be wrapped. Series A will end up running much longer. Part of me thinks I should focus on Series B, which is closer to ending, to just get it done. Having a fully finished book would also be more marketable. However, part of me thinks I should instead focus on the more popular series I enjoy making more and come back to Series B to bring it to its conclusion eventually. I really want to finish Series B, but if the market demand isn't there, is it a waste of time to put my focus there? Any advice is helpful because I'm super tired. I appreciate the show every week, and thank you for taking my questions. So, Dave, we've got, I'm going to try to encapsulate it. Series A, she likes it more, and it's more popular. Series B is more niche and less popular, but it's almost finished, and that might make it more marketable to be able to put something out that is a completely finished story. Her question is, what does she work on next?
This is a great question. So I'm assuming it's been sort of a back and forth, a little bit of Series A, a little bit of Series B, a little Series A, a little A, B, a little A, B, A, B, A, B. And I get that exhaustion makes you want to choose between them. But a part of me feels like, and this is a tricky one because like there is truth to the fact that if the series is finished, it is a teeny tiny, almost negligibly small amount more marketable in terms of, hey, this is a finished story. If you start it, there is an end to it. Yes, there's a tiny sliver of the population for whom that's persuasion type language. But if it hasn't proven to be extremely popular or marketable for most of its run, not a great sign that it's going to have this sudden spurt at the end.
Right.
However, there's a lot to be said for just finishing something in life. Like you've gotten this far, why not just put the finishing bow on it so that you can say, I did this series, it's a full, complete series, versus the less satisfactory of like, oh, I did a series and I got 2 issues away from finishing it, but I never finished it, you know?
Yeah.
That'll a little bit be the one that got away if that happens. However, God, I'm going back and forth on my own advice. There's a lot to be said for leaning into what's working.
Yes. And the one that you like more.
And the one you like more, which also speaks to the fact that your energy is coming through on the work. It's probably, your energy is probably begrudgingly coming through on Series B, which is the less popular one. So I'm actually going to hand this to Brad because now I'm counteracting my own counteracting advice, and I don't even I don't know up from down. Brad, what do you think?
Well, you went through the same series that I went through. When I was looking at this question, I went through exactly what you went through. It's like, do you tell her to do the less popular one to get it done, or do you tell her to do the one that she likes more because she likes it more and it's more popular, knowing full well that if you go down that road, there's a significant chance that you never go back to Series B.
Yes.
And it remains unfinished. Like you don't want to tell her to do that. You don't want to say, well, lean into Series A. It's the clear winner and it's the one you enjoy more, because then Series B very, very likely remains unfinished. So here's my advice. So I'm going to take all the emotion out of it. I'm going to take basically everything she told us and throw it out. I'm going to take everything out except for the first sentence. Go back to the first sentence.
Okay.
I work on two series simultaneously, going back and forth by the two, issue by issue. So the answer is, since I can't tell you to go with Series A because that has fallbacks, and I can't tell you to go with Series B because that has fallbacks or drawbacks, I'm going to tell you whichever one that you're scheduled to do, then do that one. In other words, if it's Series A, if its turn is up, then start working on Series A and work on that issue. If it's turn for Series B, then go to Series B. In other words, the answer to the question is whichever one is scheduled to be worked on next, do that thing.
So your answer is stay the course, just get it done. If we're looking at it,
if you keep going A, B, and you end it on B, then it's time to go to A.
Yeah. Okay. With the idea that she's saying she's so tired, Brad, and I feel that in that write up. So I'm sympathetic to that. I have a version of Brad's advice that I think I now want to go with. I think this is where I land on this, having thought this through now. So, starting with the idea that you were doing A, then you were doing B, then A, then B, and switching back and forth and back and forth, back and forth.
Right.
I don't want you to give up on B. I want you to get it to the finish line, because there's a lot that's instructive as an artist in finishing a project, right? We talk about that on the show, of like, finish the thing. Just finishing it, both from a writing, an art, and a marketing standpoint, is instructive. Like, you'll learn a lot by bringing it in for the landing, right?
Yeah.
But you're enjoying A more, it's giving you more energy. So here is my advice, and it's a modification of Brad's advice. Stay the course, but at a 75-25 level. So if you normally, it takes you a month to finish a series for B, do about a week's worth on B, then do 3 weeks of A, then a week's worth on B, then 3 weeks of A, then a week's worth on B, then 3. So it's going to take you longer to get B out to those final 2 episodes. But over the course of the next year, you'll get it out. It's just that, or maybe it's going to take you 2 years. I don't know. What I'm saying is you'll have more energy. The popular piece will be getting more of you, so your overall career will be growing to a greater extent. But you'll still reserve 25, 30, 40% of your time to work on B just to get it done. And I think that's a great way to go about it, where you just shift the time devotion a little bit. So instead of being 50-50, you go 60-40 or 70-30 or 75-25. What Brad looks not so happy with that suggestion. So let's see what he has to say.
So what you're basically saying is you've got a nice thick juicy steak on your plate, and you've got some peas, and you got to eat them both. And you don't like peas particularly. You love steak, but you got to eat them both to have a well-balanced dinner tonight. So what you're saying is take 3 bites of steak, 1 bite of peas. 3 bites of steak, 1 bite of peas. You'll finish your dinner. and then you'll feel good about having a good dinner, right?
Right,
So
right. Because otherwise you'll do the Dave Keller technique. You'll leave the peas to the end. And then like Brad said, you'll never go back to the peas. And you'll be sad you didn't finish
You'll
the peas.
hide them under the mashed potatoes where they belong. and go right onto the cheesecake. We haven't talked about the cheesecake yet.
Yeah,
We still have to talk about cheesecake.
Yeah. Well, no, but you know what? Can I just say, continuing your metaphor there, if we're honest about it, the project that you're going to do after A and B, the cheesecake in Brad's metaphor, the way better project that's better than A, better than B, but it will be informed by the fact that you finished B and that you kept the energy of A. So I do think in the long term of your career, there's a lot of benefit to finishing something, especially when you're so close. If you're almost at the finish line, but there's no need to punish yourself. You're not a 14th century monk. You don't need to flagellate with a whip. Just do it to a lesser percentage of your time. It's twice this week that I've talked about self-flagellation.
Yeah, you're really on this whip thing.
Is there something you need to talk about? I think we're learning a lot about Dave Keller. I don't know what's going on here. No, I guess in a past life I was a monk. Anyway. That got weird.
I love that you couldn't even finish the sentence. I was the
bailed.
monk.
Did you notice how quickly I bailed out? I was like, man, the hell with that.
It was just that you got that dreamy look in your eye and kind of. I was the monk that.
Anyway, just a reminder to Spain, we're available as cultural assets. So anyway, that's my thought is you're using the energy of A. It's taken up 75% of your time. The audience is loving it. The audience is growing. And also B is not sapping your energy as it might. I'm guessing it does a little bit, right? But if you only do 15, 20, 30% of your energy or time rather on B, I think it balances it out really well. And it's going to take you longer, but you're not giving up. It's going to get done. And A is getting the bulk of you. I think that's the best possible advice here.
I think that's good advice. I think we've given this person two choices that are really good. In other words, just do whichever one comes next. Or I like your steak and peas reference too. I think doing it that way would work really well. I think those are two very good options. And listen, write us back. Let us know which one you went with and how it turned out, because I'd really like to know how this one ends up.
Regardless, I think both Brad and I wish you all the best, and congratulations on having two projects that you've gotten to this stage. One in terms of excitement and energy and popularity. Another one in terms of just getting it done. Just getting something to a finish line is a great thing in life. So congratulations from Brad and I on that. And I will jump us into our next question, Brad. Comes in over at patreon.com/comiclab. And this comes in from Insomniac Overlord saying, hey guys, Tom here with an art question. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was from Insomniac Overlord. It's from Tom. Tom, what's happening here? Hey guys, Tom here with an art question. In my full color comics, I've run into a snag. I find my art looks best on a black page, that is with black paper in the gutters. But I feel like this is a crutch. I start every book with white paper, but often scenes are dark, and it's garish to see a dark scene surrounded by white. Is it a problem with the art's brightness making the white gutters look bad, or is it fine to use black gutters if they look good, and can it be printed? So, Brad, this is a great question for you who have such a good knowledge of both printing and of comics history. What are your thoughts on black gutters and the use of black gutters in storytelling?
It's interesting that he talks about black paper because, I mean, obviously what he means is it's you're putting black ink on the paper. But when I was younger, I actually thought when I saw those black pages in comics that they were using a special black paper that they were printing on. And then
you're right. When I was a kid, I did have that thought. Yes.
Yeah. But actually what it is what they're doing is they're putting down a black background and then they're setting up a bleed. And this is actually what I want to talk about, because to get that black to go all the way to the edge of the paper, so there's not some kind of a white border around it, they have to actually print it way past the edge of the paper, and then it's trimmed. So a printer would cut that And since they're cutting it midway through that bleed, it looks like the ink goes all the way to the edge of the paper because they cut off the part that goes further and then finally stops. Right. That's called a bleed. And if it doesn't sound familiar, if my description doesn't sound like it's putting a picture in your head, just look up a printer's bleed and you'll see exactly in an image what I'm talking about. So I don't really care whether you use a black gutter or a white gutter. That goes back to your aesthetic that you are developing. And if your aesthetic tells you that the colors look better with a black gutter, fine. I'm not going to tell you that it doesn't. I want you to follow that aesthetic to wherever it leads. And if you're saying certain pages look better with a white gutter and certain pages look better with a black gutter and you go back and forth, that's great too. My only advice to you is that as you're setting these pages up, make sure that you're drawing that black background on your page wide enough, deep enough, so that you've got plenty of room for the bleed, so that when eventually it comes time to print the book, that you're not putting yourself in a situation where you've got to go and redo a bunch of pages because you didn't set the bleed up right. So my only advice to you is I'm not going to get involved in your aesthetics because I want you to make that decision based on what you think is best. My only advice is make sure you're covering your bleed appropriately so you don't give yourself more trouble in the end.
I think that's good advice. I personally, my own aesthetic doesn't tend to like a black gutter, but I very much recognize that for certain types of comics, if you have a comic set in deep space, for example, a black gutter can be really affecting in terms of how it influences the art versus a white. You know, if every scene is set in deep space and there's an astronaut floating through space and yet the gutters are white, I see. Or if you're doing an Alien versus Predator comic, or if you're doing a Halo comic, I can see a lot of certain aesthetics, or a horror comic that a black gutters are very useful. To me, when they're used in comics, and by this I mean sort of jokey comics or sort of, slice of life comics, it feels like 5% more emo than it needs to be when it has a black gutter, but it's fine. Also, that's perfectly fine as an aesthetic choice. To Brad's point, it's if that's the way you want to go, you know your comic best, and it's perfectly fine. The one thing that I do want to comment on, technically, when you have black gutters, is I just want you to be careful, because I've seen this done wrong a couple times, about if you're doing your line work or your in-panel blacks as rich black, but you're doing your gutters as 100% K black, and how that can mess up the whole works for what you're going for in terms of the final print product. Brad, you're more astute in this. Do you want to take someone through the difference between what a full rich black is and what a slightly less impactful 100% K black, which counterintuitively sounds like it's going to be 100% black, but it's actually not so black. Do you mind taking people through that?
Black ink is actually pretty weak. We think black and that it's just going to black out everything. But if you've ever seen, every now and again, you'll see a document that's been redacted with black ink, and you can see through the black ink what they were redacting. That when the government
accidentally releases something and you can still see through it.
And black ink is actually pretty weak. And to get a true, really dark black, you got to use the other colors. And in offset printing, that's cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So a rich black is used with all four colors, not 100%, because that the ink density becomes unwieldy at that point. Usually for me, my rich black is about 60% cyan, 40% magenta, 20% yellow, and then 100% black.
Wow, you got real specific there. Good job. All right.
Well, you know what? What happens is I had to decide, especially for me and my colorist, Alex Eberling, we kind of came up with a zone that it is. And so if you do the exact same one every time, there's no variance. It's like, this is what it is, 60, 40, 20, 100.
Right.
So yeah, it is. I've been doing it for years, with the same numbers. But if you put that next to just a 100% black with not any cyan, magenta, or yellow, that black is going to look gray in comparison to it.
It does look gray.
It's going to look really, really weak. So yeah, what Dave is saying is right. You definitely want a rich black making up your black zones.
But as always the case, and rich black is great for black gutters because a little bit of accidental offset is fine because it's a gutter. But just a reminder that when you're doing rich black, you're really getting 4 plates aligned and hitting the same spot to get that dark color, right? And to give you sort of a visual metaphor from our childhood, remember when you had those rubber stamps and it was like a carving of a butterfly in a rubber stamp, right? Yeah. Imagine you had 4 identical carvings of that butterfly, and one goes into the yellow ink, one goes into the blue ink, one goes into the red, one goes into the black. But you then have to line up the ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk of the stamp 4 times so that it perfectly makes that butterfly, right?
Yeah.
And so for gutters, it's not a problem because it's a gutter is such a big swing print-wise that it's like it could be off by, I don't know, Brad, give me a number, but it would be okay-ish if it was off a little tiny bit in any direction.
Right, by like a micron or so.
Yeah, exactly. Where rich blacks get tricky is when you're using rich black for detailed work or rich black for lettering especially, where if the stamps are even slightly off, again, back to those childhood metaphor of the butterflies that we're trying to stamp, if it's off even slightly, the lettering starts to look like those 1950s comics where it's the offsetting's a little bit off, you know?
Yeah.
So just be careful of it, but also be conscious of the fact that do you want to go with 100% K black or do you want to go with rich black in your blacks?
Yeah. And what Dave's talking about is being off register or out of register.
Thank you. That was the phrase I was trying to get to. Yeah.
And if you need to, again, if we're not doing a good job of giving you a visual picture, just put in out of register printing into an image search and you'll see what we're talking about. Now, for most presses, they're really, really good. It's not like, I came up through newspapers where registration was really a serious issue. We had to really be careful.
It was done by Sledgehammer, though. They were
never in register. Today, if you're offset printing a book, that you can pretty much guarantee to a certain extent that those are going to be really, really close. But for like a hairline rule or something like that, or like Dave says, even typography, you've got to be a little bit more careful. What Alex and I do with typography is she does set up a second layer to make my typography a rich black, but the characters are reduced by about 2 pixels. So it's inside the letter form so that if it does nudge a little bit up or down, it still gives me to the naked eye a rich black. But if it does happen to nudge a little bit, it's not going to come outside of the letter form.
Right.
So we've gotten into the habit of doing that a long time ago. It's an extra step. It makes things very complicated in the very often happenstance that Brad makes a spelling error. And it's got to be changed because now that's going to be changed literally by hand with 2 layers. That's got to be moved around. There's nothing more upsetting to me than finding a spelling error after I finished all of this stuff because it takes a few minutes to fix. And I wish I was better. Somebody's like, Brad, I guess your spell checker doesn't work. Well, Clip Studio doesn't have a spell checker. I would use it. That's one thing I really wish for is a spell checker in Clip Studio. Unfortunately, it's just not available to me. These are all things you've got to kind of keep in mind when you're setting this up, and they all fall under a rich black purview.
Yeah, and the one last technical thing that I'll mention, if you're going with all black gutters and you're doing a bleed like like Brad suggests, and I do agree with, just keep in mind that a full book of all black gutters with a bleed will give you a spine, an outward-facing spine that is mostly blackish, and that's usually fine, right? But sometimes, depending on the paper that you have, it gives you an unsatisfying somewhat black, somewhat speckled white, sometimes gray edging on the paper, to the point where you might want to clean up that look with what's called a spine printing, where they actually run a little bit of a kind of a roller across the edges of the book, right? And so I think they did that, Brad, with with Sarah Anderson's fangs, right? But just keep in mind that sometimes that bleed gives you an unsatisfying edging on the spine facing side, and you may or may not like it, but just be aware that might be something you have to deal with.
It's so funny. The more we talk about this, the more opinions I have.
Oh, okay.
If you're doing this black gutter thing, another thing I want you to pay very careful attention to is how this looks on social media. For example, on a social media post, the first thing I would do is take that black gutter off, because I think it's going to create an awkward composition. I think it's going to create relations where they don't belong. You know what I mean? I think it's going to look bad in a social media post to have those black gutters, or to have any color inside of that. Especially if you're doing a vertical scroll, especially if that gutter, if that black isn't going all the way out to the edges, you know what I mean? It's gonna look awkward very quick. So the more I think about it, the more that there's like ancillary concerns here. I just want to encourage you to think carefully about taking those black gutters out in your online, or at least in your social media posts. I think you really got to consider that.
And then broadening this out for other listeners who are not Tom. And Tom, by the way, going back to it, again, I'm perfectly fine with you making the aesthetic choice to use black gutters on this. So keep that as a given. But for other people that are not Tom, I will say that if you're 50-50 on black gutters, or you're not sure, keep in mind that black gutters can be a really effective storytelling technique when you get to a moment of great gravity or pathos or internal torment, or a moment of action or horror, where if you have white gutters, and then there's a moment of incredible internal torture for a character where their parent just died, or they've just gotten a divorce as a character, or someone they have to make a terrible choice. A couple pages with black gutters is really impactful as being one of those tools that you can bring in to help oomph that story up in that moment, you know?
I'll never forget John Byrne's run on the Fantastic Four when Sue Storm was delivering their second baby, I think, and she was having complications. Do you remember this story? There's only one man that can help them because of his understanding of radiation. I guess she had gotten cosmic rays in the X zone, or what's the negative zone. The negative zone.
I don't know this. By the way, as someone who didn't read Fantastic Four, this all sounds like nonsense. There's only one man who knows the radiation of the X zone. And you're like, what? What is this
nonsense? Guess who the man was? The only man that could save Sue Storm's pregnancy was Dr. Octopus.
What?
It was,
all right.
Yes, such a great story. So now Reed Richards has to show.
I gotta tell you though, those 8 arms make for an awkward baby delivery. That's a weird situation.
Yeah. Well,
all right, I'm gonna need you to push.
Yeah. He's great when it comes to triplets. Yeah, he's great for multiple births, but
he also does a good roto-rooter in the background while you're. He's like, I'll clog that drain for you.
Yeah, clean out the sink while you're here. Yeah. So he had to go and convince Dr. Octopus, and of course, Dr. Octopus was not happy to help, and there's a big fight. Blah blah blah. In the very end, he finally convinces Dr. Octopus to come and help with this pregnancy, and they come in, and in the last page, the last panel, it's one panel in the page, and they find out that it's too late. They spent too much time fighting, and it's too late. It was one panel, black border all the way around. It was a little bit smaller panel than the entire page, and it sat at the bottom, and it delivered that news against the black all the way around. It was such a brilliant move, compositionally speaking, storytelling wise. It was such a great use of that, but it's also important to note, I think it's the only time that there was a black border and a black gutter in the entire comic, right? But the fact that they used it that one time, it hit you like a sledgehammer.
Yeah, and that's why I say, for those of us that are not leaning towards a black gutter, it's a tool to keep in the tool chest, because it's really, when it's used well, it's used really well. And in this case, Is that how we got Kang? Was that, or no, the other kid was Kang's grandfather or whatever, right?
Well, Kang was like my understanding of Kang is he was an otherworldly or an other dimension version of Doctor Doom.
Oh, I thought he was Sue Storm and what's his great grandson or something.
Oh, that might be. I might be getting it wrong because shortly after this, a few years after this, I started to kind of fall away from reading mainstream comics. So I honestly don't know. And the MCU version is probably completely different.
Oh, we are going to hear about this in the Discord server. How dare you not know that Kang is actually the... Oh, God.
Yeah, we're going to take a drubbing for this one.
Listen, I use that voice knowing that I myself sound like that anytime someone gets something wrong with Tolkien or with Alpha Flight. I'm like, I've got opinions, and the world needs to know.
Well, listen, I've got something that the world needs to know. If you want to talk about that, here's something I think the world needs to know, that you've been listening to Comic Lab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my Kang the Conqueror, Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc. at evilcomic.com.
And my Mr. Fantastic, Dave Kellett, the co-director of the comics documentary Stripped and the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com.
And the Comic Lab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net. And this episode was edited by our own Sue Storm, who will always invisibly come to help the show. I don't know where I was going with that. By Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love Comic Lab, and we know that you do, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, and you may hear your review featured on a future episode like this one. M. Zapata writes over on Apple Podcasts, "You guys have been a fun part of my mornings every week. Your mindful and positive focus needed to maintain a great work ethic has been a great motivator on understanding this industry we know as storytellers." Thank you so much, M. Zapata.
And much like the thing I'm going to tell you, gang, it is clobbering time, and Comic Lab is made possible by your support at patreon.com/Comic Lab. So we'll go ahead and say that twice. Patreon.com/ they really used clobbering time. That was a genuine phrase that they used. And I got to tell you, 8-year-old me loved it. I thought it was great. It's clobbering time.
What a revolting development this is. That was another one of his phrases. Do I
explain it?
Do I have to explain my joke? He said a number of things. He said it's clobbering time. He said what a revolting development this is. He said Yancey Street Gang. I was just throwing in another thing.
Didn't he have another one that was like Great Gertie's Ghost or something? He had a couple weird ones.
There was like my Aunt Clara or my... There was an ant or something.
He also had one with like a president or a politician. It was like...
I just gotta... this is what it's going to be at the old cartoonist home. You and me sitting in rocking chairs. Do you remember? I remember the thing had an Aunt Clara. Either that or it was Samantha from Bewitched.
I remember Wolverine sticking someone to a wall with his claws and saying, "Stick around." And I always thought that was such fun. Stick around, everyone. I'm Ben Logan. What pudding is for today?